True. I argued that widespread engagement with Demosthenes and the Attic orators throughout the Hellenistic period was not primarily rhetorical or rituary, but rather showed a remarkable, almost antiquarian interest in the institutional workings of Athenian democracy. My contention was that if we look hard at the sparse rhetorical evidence from the Hellenistic period, what we find is that the institutions of the classical Athenian democracy were in fact very much in the minds of the citizens of the Hellenistic cities. It followed that it is not absurd to postulate Athenian institutional borrowings, and even at a deeper level, a paradigmatic role of sorts for Athenian institutions as the citizens of many Hellenistic cities tackled their own institutional conundrums and built or reformed their own democratic systems. My institutional argument was therefore suggestive, but only suggestive, of the possibility of wider Athenian influence. I wasn't brave enough to attempt to identify such an influence in specific institutional choices. My hesitation had several roots. The most obvious was a fear of Athenocentrism, that most horrible sin among Greek historians, deserving in many circles of capital punishment. Historians that concern themselves primarily with classical Athens sometimes these days are accused of Athenocentrism a priori. So it is important not to assume Athenian influence even when Athenian influence seems to be screaming in your face. You just need to keep repeating to yourself, polycentric, 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 like a mantra, and take a few long breaths. But the more serious problem is that, short of some source explicitly saying that a particular institution was imported from Athens, institutional affiliation, or even just influence, is hard to pin down and prone to confirmation bias. So much of the evidence is Athenian, and so many things appear first in the Athenian record. Does this mean that they were invented there? That they were borrowed from there? Couldn't other cities get there on their own because they shared a basic cultural and institutional koine that could develop faced with similar challenges in similar directions? So these are the reasons of my original hesitation. But I am glad to see that David and Shane are braver men than I was, and I take their invitation to go beyond Athenocentrism as an encouragement no longer to be afraid. Looking for Athenian influence and derivation in the institutions of many Hellenistic cities does not one Athenocentric make. At the same time, I have no intention to throw caution to the wind, and my case study resolutely sits at the micro level invoked by the organizers. What I plan to do for the rest of this talk is first to describe the technicalities of the use of Psephophoria, vote by secret ballot, in the Athenian assembly, specifically for the purpose of naturalization. Second, I turn to discussing early Hellenistic inscriptions whose evidence suggests that when Psephophoria first appears in the epigraphical record of the Hellenistic cities, it is used in a way that is remarkably close to the Athenian arrangement. I shall then close with some considerations about possible criteria to adjudicate whether such arguments for institutional borrowing and derivation are more or less compelling. How close to the institutions in question need to be? How much difference is too much difference? Are there other corroborating factors that can be brought in to enhance the probability of actual influence? As we all know, the Greek word for the decision of a political assembly or council is psephisma, meaning literally a thing voted with pebbles, psephoi. Thus, etymologically, the basic idea behind the word seems to be that of making collectively a decision by secret ballot and then counting the votes. Etymology, however, is a very unsafe guide in this instance. For one, despite the word used to indicate them, most psephismata were adopted after a vote by show of hands, keirotonia, and the hands were not actually counted, but vaguely assessed by the relevant magistrates, proedroi, keiroskopoi, keirokritai. Psephophoria was used only for a small minority of specific issues, and what these issues were, and when Psephophoria should be used, was clearly prescribed by the laws. In Athens, Psephophoria in the assembly was mandated by law in the 4th century, as far as we know, in 2 circumstances only, and I point here to number 1 on my handout. To allow with a quorum of 6,000 matters concerning Athenian state debtors to be discussed and decisions about them to be made in the assembly, and to ratify, again with a quorum of 6,000, naturalization decrees enacted by Chaerotonia in the previous assembly meeting. The Athenians could not pick and choose when they should use Psephophoria. They used it only when prescribed by the law, and in the cases in which it was prescribed, they always used it. The ratification vote by Psephophoria is in fact explicitly mentioned with the same formula in all 80 extant Athenian naturalization decrees between 385 and 229 BCE. The very limited use of Psephophoria in Athenian political decision-making and its specific procedural arrangements are explainable to a certain extent, yet rather idiosyncratic in some of their details. Psephophoria was standard in the judicial context, yet it was rather impractical in an assembly context. This was due to two connected issues. First, the nature of Greek numeracy. Second, how time-consuming it was. Historians have described Greek numeracy as a counterculture. Counters were small, easily movable tokens, and I quote here sparsely from an article by Netz, which allowed users to make calculations by moving them on the surface of an abacus. Counting and calculations were not primarily a mental process, but rather practical performances characterized by specific procedures and gestures performed with the counters on the abacus, which produced the result. In Netz's words, counters were not some aid to the manipulation of numbers. They were the medium of numerical manipulation par excellence. We imagine numbers as an entity seen on the page. The Greeks imagined them as an entity grasped between the thumb and the finger. Because numeracy was so intrinsically connected to particular tools, counters and the abacus, its presence in the public domain was differential. The Greeks chose to use it in specified contexts and not in others, in specific formats and not in others. The choice to use numeracy in political decision-making with Psephophoria involved, by definition, the performance of the usual procedures with counters and the abacus. Psephoi are, in fact, quite simply counters. Votes were cast before the assembly had actually started, as people entered the assembly setting, and the Psephoi were then counted on abaci. The whole process must have been slow and laborious, as in Athens assembly meetings were attended on average by more than 6,000 people, and there were in most polis several hundreds or even thousands of citizens. Understanding the workings of Greek numeracy and visualizing the process of Psephophoria helps explain why it was used so sparsely and only for specific and well-defined purposes. First, it could not be improvised. Psephoi and urns had to be ready at the entrance of the assembly for people to cast their votes as they went in, so its use had to be planned in advance. Second, only a small number of Psephophoria per meeting wherever possible, possibly only one where citizen numbers were high, because the whole procedure was too time-consuming. Third, Psephophoria was not available as an ad hoc choice during an assembly meeting. It was overall a rather cumbersome and inflexible procedure. Chaerotonia, on the other hand, which did not involve the engagement of numeracy per se, had the advantage of being quicker and more flexible. So this is why Psephophoria was used only sparsely in political decision-making. But why was it used at all? Why did the Athenians choose to recur in the assembly to a voting system normally associated with the law courts? Philippe Gautier has argued convincingly that its main purpose was to check that a quorum had been reached, as the votes could only be counted with a Psephophoria. And in fact, the two instances in which it was used in Athens are the two known cases in which the Athenian assembly in the 4th century required a quorum of 6,000. So this is what is more or less explainable. And here is what is rather idiosyncratic. First, the specific issues for which it was used. Adeia, rather rare, and most of all, naturalization. Historians have attempted to find some unifying rationale for the choice of these specific usages. They have argued that Psephophoria was considered appropriate, given its judicial credentials, presumably, for issues that regarded specific individuals. But this is grasping at straws. If this was the rationale, then why wasn't Psephophoria used for all honorary decrees, or for ad hoc trials and proboli in the assembly, or for Eisangeliae in the council? For our purposes, it is better just to register these usages and file away the fact that, for whatever reason, its importance, the Athenians must have just decided at some point in the early 4th century that naturalization in particular should require a quorum and secret ballot. The second idiosyncratic feature of the procedure is the fact that Psephophoria is in both instances prescribed as an additional vote, not as the only vote of approval. In naturalization decisions, it was only a vote of ratification, but the initial approval had been reached by Keirotonia in the previous assembly meeting. And in the case of Adeia, the vote was only on whether the debate should take place, but the actual vote on whatever measure was enacted was held by Keirotonia, by show of hands. To sum up, what we have in Athens is a bundle of institutional features combined in a rather non-obvious arrangement. First, Psephophoria is mainly a judicial voting system and is prescribed by law for the assembly only in rare instances. Second, it is prescribed together with a quorum when there is a need to make sure that the quorum has been reached. Third, when it occurs, it is never the only vote, but rather one of authorization or, much more often, of ratification, which occurs at a different assembly meeting, with the standard approval of the decree happening previously by Keirotonia. Fourth, it is associated primarily with honorific decrees granting citizenship. If we move beyond Athens to those Hellenistic polis in which Psephophoria procedures in the assembly can be reconstructed in some detail, we do find that they often follow rather close to the Athenian model, down to its most obvious idiosyncrasies, and despite the occasional procedural variation and the employment of different formulas and language. So I start with a Samian honorific decree found in Kos, which is a 2 on your handout, which was tackled in an illuminating study by Gauthier some 20 years ago. The decree is dated between 306 and 301 BC. It contains a series of honors for co and foreign judges and for Samos proxenoi in Kos that accompanied them to Samos. A number of these honors are enacted straight away with the inscribed decree, but 2 of them, citizenship and proxeny, are to be ratified in accordance with the law at a later assembly meeting in the month of Antesterion, when the elections are held, by Psephophoria. At that meeting, the Prytanes are to put citizenship and proxeny for the honorant to the vote as is prescribed by the law. The similarities with Athens are striking. Like in Athens, there was a law ordering an additional vote of ratification by Psephophoria for particular honors. And therefore, like in Athens, the decision to use Psephophoria was not ad hoc, but mandated by law for particular purposes. Like in Athens, Psephophoria was not used on its own, but was meant to follow a Keirotonia as a form of ratification. Finally, like in Athens, naturalization figures as a key issue in need of ratification by secret ballot. There are, however, also subtle procedural and substantive differences. Unlike in Athens, in Samos, not only naturalization, but also proxeny appears to have required ratification by Psephophoria. And while in Athens, the ratification occurred in the following assembly, in Samos, it occurred at the particular meeting of the month Antesterion. My second case study comes from Samothrace, and is 3 on your handout. Here, the procedure for granting citizenship, attested in inscription of the 3rd and early 2nd centuries, appears to be similar to the Athenian and to the Samian model. Normally, Samothracian citizenship decrees have relatively uninformative formulas, but IG 12.8.158 provides fuller information because the decree inscribed is in fact a probuleuma of the council, which details the procedure the assembly must follow to grant citizenship to the honorant, Ptolemaios of Gortyn. So we read that the council has resolved that the presiding officers, epistatas, in the assembly should submit the question eperotesai, of whether to grant citizenship to Ptolemaios kataton nomon. The decree details how this should happen. The people should be asked whether they resolve to give citizenship to Ptolemaios and his descendants, and if they do, there must be a Psephophoria in the appropriate assembly meeting, and if that is successful, Ptolemaios is to be a citizen. Here, as in Athens and in Samos, naturalization is required by law to be ratified after the original approval by show of hands, with a Psephophoria held in a separate assembly meeting. My third case study is Iasos, and this is 4 in your handout, where at some point during the 3rd century, we start finding 2 categories of honorary decrees, as shown some time ago by Charles Crowther. First, decrees that grant a number of high honors, but do not award citizenship and sometimes proxeny, and that often prescribe that these should be deliberated upon later in Aphrodisian at a specific assembly meeting. And second, decrees enacted actually in Aphrodisian at the appropriate assembly meeting, which do award citizenship and sometimes proxeny. The decrees of the first category are considered